drugs are discovered for a reason, right? So is it to cure a disease? So so innovation is not just to come up with an effective therapeutics. It is also something that is affordable. If it's not used, it's no good. It's not yummy. So think about a company that comes up with a car, fancy, great running, but no one buys it. So is there any value in it? So a pharmaceutical product is only valuable if it reaches the hands of the people who need them. So and the pricing gets in the way. So people can't access it, can't afford it. Or in order to afford that medication, they have to make sacrifices. So they trade-off decisions. Am I going to have to cut my grocery spendings, or am I going to have to take a second job, right? That induces more stress and this and that. So that is not fair. So and knowing the fact that you pay your taxes and you trust the fact that the government is going to allocate this tax dollars in a way that it could support innovation, and then next year, in decades, when you need a drug, it is going to be there. So that's the system design to the function. But if knowing that you're not going to be able to access it because pharma company gets greedy is it's unfair, and public has the right to know. My name is Öner Tulum. I have been, I'm co-founder of AirNet, Academic Industry Research Network. So my colleague and longtime mentor, Bill Lozanek, has actually, documented that the whole evolution of the maximizing shareholder value ideology, how it took off and how it become prevalent in the U.S. and how it's actually spreading across the globe. So the issue here is that so we actually finance the business. That's why we have the basically first saying in terms of how the value to be captured and distributed. So, so they are nowhere to be found in actually the value creation process. If you consider the fact that a drug is not invented yesterday, a drug is not discovered 2 or 5 years ago. It's been a long and arduous process of innovation. It involves, hundreds of thousands of actors, the researchers, the manufacturers, and even sometimes often overlooked, actors in this process is actually the patients who actually participate in those clinical trials. So, and the physicians and all that, and most importantly, the taxpayers. So basically, up until the point when a drug is considered a safe bet to make and bring it to the clinical trial process, there is a long process that often overlooked. And when shareholders make this argument that we actually have the right to capture the value first is unfounded. And our research shows that it is actually dismissive, given that this collective and cumulative process involved in drug innovation is completely disregarded, and that's discouraging, given that the value created by a pharmaceutical company really depends on the value created by the scientists and the taxpayers. We're already working on. I don't mean we, but I mean this innovation ecosystem. So the innovation ecosystem has so many different inhabitants, and some of the important actors are the scientists, right? The researchers. They're already working on tomorrow's medicine. So they're already working, tirelessly to feed the pipeline that pharmaceutical companies are constantly evaluating and deciding which ones to take to clinical trial, clinical trials or clinical stage. So basically, the system is being funded already, thanks to generous contributions of taxpayers, right? So we are funding the research in universities, and those, fundamental research or translational research eventually start generating some leads that pharmaceutical companies are going to come around and start shopping, like. So, and then again, they're going to start, doing additional further clinical work on it. And start, launching commercializing the product, launching the product, and start generating revenue. So this system has been going somehow. This division of labor and this funding cycle has been bringing them the market in the world, pharmaceutical industry in the U.S. Made the pharmaceutical industry in the world successful. But going forward, we don't necessarily need to price it the way we have been doing it, because if you look at how the excess profits are actually distributed, it feels like the industry needs the high drug prices to maintain the shareholder payouts, not necessarily to maintain the innovation. So that's actually, I think, the argument I would come up. And then again, our research shows that shareholder contributions or financial contributions from shareholders are really not the critical ingredient in making this innovation successful. Fairness is a very tricky concept. So fairness to whom, right? So if you argue that it's not fair to shareholders because if you impose, price restrictions and that we can't generate the profit that we used to get, then yes, you're right. But the fairness is very limited, a very constrained concept there. So fairness, ultimately, these drugs are for patients, the end users, right? So I would ask, whether these prices are really fair to patients. So, and obviously, evidence and various different research shows that it's not. So there are people who are actually making very tough choices whether or not to stay on medication, whether or not to take their medication, whether or not they have access to it, whether or not they're breaking the bank or they're really jeopardizing their finances to stay on that medication. And that's just the U.S. context. How about the rest of the world? So whether these innovative therapeutics are really widely accessible in the rest of the world. So those are issues that often not brought up in the discussions on the fairness. So fairness is, again, depending on from what angle you're looking at this issue from. So again, from the perspective of patients, from the perspective of taxpayers, from the perspective of scientists, researchers, I don't have the evidence that it's fair. This issue, this debate on drug prices is nothing new. Well, that's the first surprising thing, that people are usually surprised by the fact that we've been actually debating whether or not the drug prices are high, or higher than what it should be. It's been going on since the 1970s and 80s, right? So it started with, the Senate hearings, investigations, whether, pharma companies are taking advantage of this monopolistic power that they are granted, right? So when I hear people just thinking that we just started talking about this is kind of surprising to me, but that's not the most surprising. The most surprising thing is that why U.S. pays higher than the rest of the world, right? So in every cycle of this debate on drug pricing, pharma lobbies really come up with really, good actors to blame for, right? So in this cycle of debate, they come up with something called PBM, the pharmacy benefit managers. So, and then they start shifting, the blame from themselves to PBM, pharmacy benefit managers, arguing that, well, you complain about the high list prices, but we don't keep that. The argument they essentially make is that for the $100 we actually want to charge as a list price, we don't actually get to keep it all. So some other actors in the value chain get to keep that as much as 40% of that profit. So people until very recently weren't aware of this actor called pharmacy benefit managers, and now regulators, taxpayers are questioning the function of PBM. And to what extent they're also to blame for this rising drug prices. So what do PBMs do? They do negotiate on drug prices with the drug companies on behalf of the insurer or the sponsor, right? In the case of Medicare, it's on behalf of the taxpayers. So, and who does this? In other countries, it's the governments, the national health systems. In the UK, in Germany, the government of Germany sits down and talks to drug companies and says, hey, this is how much I want to pay. I can't pay any higher than that. So in this country, this system is highly fragmented for political reasons. So, which we can discuss. It's a completely, different topic. But I find it very surprising that first, people are not aware of who are the actors involved in this value capturing, efforts. And second, this is not something very recent. This is a phenomenon. I would argue it's even going back to the end of the Second World War, when we came out with this wonder drugs, the steroids and the antibiotics and penicillin. The war ended. It's the peacetime, and all of a sudden the price of antibiotics and everything else is going up, and some of the legislators start asking the question, are we paying more than what we're supposed to, given that we pretty much sink all the capital in to make these products come to market. This growing inequality is really changing the power dynamics. So, and putting people with, access to capital or with the wealth in better position. And so that really, the rhetoric basically undermining government, the role of government, the role of regulations, the role of government trying to level the playing field and make sure that the capitalism, works for everybody, and people, there's equity and everybody. It's a win-win situation essentially, right? So everybody benefits from the growth or from the expansion of economy. Unfortunately, changing power dynamics makes me feel that it is no longer a level playing field anymore, and we, in the absence of when shrinking the role of government, when dismissing the regulatory power of a legislative branch with government, it makes me think that capitalism is transforming into something that is hard to control, and it's not be benefiting everyone who contribute in the system. Every day, I start my day reading the headlines, and headlines are just focusing on the market, stock market, and it's just it is something that really affects everybody's thinking. So we're too focused on market performance. Organizations, companies, executives, managers, everybody's too focused on how the market is going to perform. And that just is problematic. Again, every day when we get up, when we go to work, not with thinking, ideally, how we can actually serve our customers, how we can actually really make our company or our organization, our work, worth for others. Unfortunately, we stop thinking that way. We just start focusing more and more about, whether or not the market is going to tank, whether or not the market is going to perform, whether or not it's going to expand. So that I see as a risk because we can't really model around economic growth without, leaving market performance or aside. So that's, I think, is a risk. And other risk is lack of cooperation and too much of centralized, governance of innovation. So yes, we are great at innovation power, but it's becoming more and more concentrated. And once we actually erect barriers, when we stop cooperating with other innovative institutions, when we restrict the flow of talent, brain power, that could really backfire, and we could just really harm the system, this innovation ecosystem. We don't know who gets how much cut from the price of pharmaceutical product. So this lack of transparency is the major issue. So you go to Europe, you don't know you're a French patient, want to buy a drug. You don't know how much the patient in the UK pays for it, right? You're part of a union, but you don't even know the countries are charging differently because they have different arrangements with the pharmaceutical companies. You don't know what your product that you're buying, the pharmaceutical company has arrangement with the retail pharmacy, with the PBM, with the insurance. So this lack of transparency really makes it difficult to assess, okay, so who's paying how much and whether or not we're really taking advantage of. So transparency is, I think, the most imminent issue. And the second is this mindset of the people who run these companies, right? So managers. So they're just too focused on share prices, the performance of the company stock prices, and just too focused on generating value for shareholders, and everything else is secondary. That's also the one of the primary drivers of the rising drug prices in this country. So the drug company gets involved usually at a stage when there is a greater degree of certainty that the drug is going to succeed. But when the taxpayers get involved with this process, there's a great level of uncertainty whether or not it's going to work, right? So as scientists show up every day for work thinking about how they can actually really come up with something that's not actually considered before, or something that there's an issue, there's a problem that needs to be dealt with, but it's usually not going to be done in the profit seeking platform. So because scientists who work at the nonprofit universities don't have that profit motivation, they can just think about more long-term issues, more complex problems. So then who gives the opportunity to scientists to do their work, right, is actually the taxpayers. They're the people who contribute in the system early stages. So they, of course, have a right to know whether or not their values are factored in the pricing decisions, and whether or not they are really stuck with the risk and excluded from the reward distribution process. Drugs are discovered for a reason, right? So is it to cure a disease? So so innovation is not just to come up with an effective therapeutics. It is also something that is affordable. If it's not used, it's no good. It's not, so think about a company that comes up with a car, fancy, great running, but no one buys it. So is there any value in it? So a pharmaceutical product is only valuable if it reaches the hands of the people who need them. So and the pricing gets in the way. So people can't access it, can't afford it. Or in order to afford that medication, they have to make sacrifices. So they trade-off decisions. Am I gonna have to cut my grocery spendings, or am I gonna have to take a second job, right? That induces more stress and this and that. So that is not fair. So and knowing the fact that you pay your taxes and you trust the fact that the government is going to allocate this tax dollars in a way that it could support innovation, and then next day, next year, in decades, when you need a drug, it is going to be there. So that's the system design to the function. But if knowing that you're not going to be able to access it because pharma company gets greedy is it's unfair, and then the public has the right to know.